several different industries. So at the moment, and for the last 6 years, I've worked primarily in the full purpose, non-for-profit, charity, NGO type sector. But I have worked across the spectrum, education, consultancy, etc., etc. But one of my specialist areas is EDI. I've been working in EDI in and around probably since my master's dissertation a long time ago. So I'm really going to give a bit more of a background as to how psychometrics started. Most people will know the answers, but how that impacts their use now, and also got some questions for yourselves too, as to how you use it and what you think about when you're using the psychometrics in different use cases. I'm specifically really talking about in this session about psychometric use in selection. For development, I think there's a little bit more nuance, and I think that's a totally separate conversation. But I'm mainly talking about in a selection setting. So, historical background. We all know that psychometrics didn't just come from the sky. Someone developed the use, but they've been around for centuries. People usually think of Francis Galton, Cattell, etc., as the originators of the term, really. But ancient civilizations have been using forms of psychometrics, like I said, for hundreds of years. And it wasn't until over 100 years ago, Francis Galton, Cattell, and others really became quite interested in the use of psychometrics for various different things, but specifically for selection processes and to choose the right type of people, you could say. So individual differences were really interesting for some people. The term psychometrics was coined, or mental test was coined by James Cattell, and then Alfred Binet also then, used that information and created the first, what we call intelligence tests. And then during the World Wars, they were used more, I suppose, more widely in different settings, but specifically in military settings. So we understand that the use has been increasing. The term, people know about it, but as we've said, how people perceive assessments is largely based on historical context. So we all know that the idea of psychometrics, especially for like the intelligence ones, is that intelligence is hereditary. And Charles Darwin was also involved in this wave of knowledge sharing, I would say, and theorizing. So Francis Galton and his cousin Charles Darwin were really around the time of the eugenics movement, which was late 19th century, early 20th century. So that's very much the potted history of psychometrics. It underpinned what we call scientific racism. So the eugenics was basically trying to get the best type of human being. So how can we create, like, I suppose, the best person in the world? What do they look like? What characteristics should they have? What height should they be? Hair color, etc. And this kind of got co-opted by different factions within society at the time. Obviously, the most obvious case of that would be the Nazi Party in the late 1930s. And it's not just them. Around that time in America, during Jim Crow as well, in the early to mid 20th century, forced sterilizations were done, used on psychometric ideas and eugenic ideas, and the tests that they would have administered to people would have been what we could probably call psychometric. So there's a long history and a long, not necessarily savory history of the use of psychometrics. And I think the idea that that's where it started does permeate how some people see psychometrics, or the word psychometrics today, to the extent where, I don't know if some of you, when you're selling our services, especially psychometrics, I don't know how many of you use the term psychometrics. Do you use the term leadership assessment? Do you use the term assessment? Because the connotations, I think, for some people are very negative, often based on these things. Also, I'm not sure if you've heard of the book, The Bell Curve by Herrnstein and Murray from 1994, I believe, where they popularized their theory, or I would say idea, that different racial groups have different IQs. And one of the most, I would say famous findings that they found was that Black people's IQ was one standard deviation below the mean. And then people from East Asian backgrounds, their IQ was one standard deviation above the mean, and white people were in the middle. And that was used to talk about groups of people and stereotype groups of people for so many different things, not just in education or work, but in society as well. So it kind of created a situation where people thought that this was fact the whole time, but it didn't actually take into consideration context, like social context, historical context, financial context. There's so many different contexts, and discrimination context too. So yeah, the next thing I'll talk about is cultural bias in psychometrics. And I would say that, again, not every single tool, not every single tool in the world, but the majority that are around that people use often are mainly from Eurocentric backgrounds, or people from Eurocentric backgrounds, deciding on what good looks like, what good performance is, who is a good performer, what are the traits that are needed to be a good performer. That's usually from a Western, very white male middle class situation. And that brings me to the next point of weird, which is an acronym used a lot in research settings. So in terms of the development of assessments, and a lot of research has been done on Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic nations. So that means the idea and the ideas of what good looks like basically is wrapped around in that. So how do we move away from that to make sure the tools that are being used are culturally specific and culturally sensitive to who we're trying to assess? Because I know a lot of people here use tools on international populations a lot. The work that I do and my colleague over there, Christelle, does, we very much use our assessments internationally. So how do we do that with nuance? How do we do that and give the right feedback to the right people? And how are we talking about different traits? So, for example, things like crystallized intelligence is very sensitive to socioeconomic status, educational history, probably cultural context as well. Differences by ethnicity are seen when assessments are measured or measure crystallized intelligence, because the idea of crystallized intelligence is very culturally based. And I think there's a lot of research that was done a long time ago, don't quote me, but I reckon like in the 70s and 80s in different cultures, where they assessed young people, children, about kind of westernized concepts of intelligence and how different populations solved those problems. And sometimes it was like the total different concept they would use to solve a problem, which would be seen if they were doing a psychometric as incorrect, but actually it wasn't incorrect. They still did it right. And this can also be seen in clinical populations. I know we're oxites here mostly, but in clinical populations with assessments for mental illness and mental support, there's a massive, massive issue with ethnocentrism and wrong interpretation of presentation. So, for example, I know a lot of clinpsychs and mental health nurses, and for example, they might get someone from a different culture presenting what looks like schizophrenia because they're talking about hearing voices or being spoken to by God or whatever. And then you'll see that on the diagnostic criteria, that's like, oh, that's not good, let's medicate. Or let's have a conversation, multidisciplinary conversation, but that's actually not really the bigger picture. And the same can be seen in, somebody told me this story once, and I was really shocked. And he said that one of the patients, I think, was eating with his hands, because a lot of ethnic food, I don't like that term, is you use your hands to eat. And that was a criteria for some kind of mental disturbance, apparently, which is wild to me, because I think the majority of the global population probably eat with their hands. So I think we're all then need to be, yeah. So that's the reason, or how culture plays into the work that we do as psychologists. And then we've also got extrinsic test bias. Differences are a result of real differences in society, not necessarily the individuals that are doing the assessments. So have we factored in, like I said, social, cultural, economic, financial issues or situations that might have affected the test score, quote unquote? And then I think I said this at the beginning, but cookie cutter ideas of what good looks like or profiling what a good leader looks like is often based on the ideas from Western educated, one specific gender. So I always say this to when we talk to clients and candidates, but specifically clients, what are you looking for and what does good look like? And then how do you know that? And then they'll say, oh, we want a really inclusive and diverse shortlist or long list. I'm like, okay, well, you've just said what you've said, and that's cut out like a lot of diversity by saying that. So actually, I think we really need to think about what we really want in a leader and how much that is affected by our ideas of, well, our ideas that have been created in the culture that we're in. So some people might think that this stuff doesn't really affect psychometrics so much anymore. And I'm not saying that every single test publisher, I'm aware that I'm sitting with people who work for test publishers, so please forgive me. But I'm not saying every single test publisher is doing things wrong. I think there's a lot of movement in the space, not just around culture and ethnicity, but as Nikita said, around neurodiversity, as well as lots of different ways to make assessments more accessible and also very useful. Because yes, we can use a psychometric, but how does that fit into the rest of the selection process? And how can we make things real for the people that we're doing the assessments for? Like, do they do the assessments and never hear about it again after the debrief? Or is it part of, you know, your development conversations or your coaching conversations and your end of year reviews? And I think some of the tools that I've heard about today, I think are really, really powerful in doing that. As we know that the justice system, the education system all use psychometrics as well. And we can see this stuff play out in those contexts. Reputable psychometrics, which is everyone in the room that uses psychometrics, we all use the reputable ones. We know that the norm grouping is actually quite good in the sense of it does capture lots of different people from lots of different places. And, you know, the language use as well is brilliant too. But when it comes to things like translation, how good is the translation? Like, is that term in the psychometric a term that can be translated? Or are we trying to fit a square peg into a round hole type of situation? Because not all language is exactly the same. So that also needs to be looked at as well a bit more closely. So yeah, I think we are progressing, but I would like to see like more focus on things like psychometric for neurodiversity. Ah. Perfect. I mean, we all know about adverse impact. We all know about the calculations, and it's done very well, again, in reputable psychometrics. But who actually measures it and who pays attention to adverse impact scores? If you can raise your hand, if you've ever looked at a psychometric and looked specifically at the adverse impact score of that psychometric. Okay. Self-selecting something. But I think it's something that we do need to look at just to check. I think most reputable psychometrics do have this data and they aren't showing signs of adverse impacts, but it doesn't mean that no bias is ever going to be there. So that also needs to be thought about. And then the last question is, like, is anyone seen an adverse impact score they didn't like and then was like, I don't want to use this? Exactly. So is it enforceable? So again, these are things I think we need to pay a bit more attention to. So the next couple of slides are going to be interesting. Not this one's fine, but the next few are going to be interesting. But there are a few steps based on a paper by Reynolds and Brown. There are a few steps as to how we can make the use of psychometrics a little bit more inclusive. Make sure the context isn't biased. Make sure that the samples and the norm groups, the correct norm groups are actually used. That's really important because sometimes you're like, oh, it's fine. We'll just use like the same norm groups we did last time. That's the reason why they're there. like someone's actually spent time to collect that data, so use the right norm group. Examiner and language bias, so the administrators as well. I mean, now the administrators are online, but anyway, still pay attention to make sure you're introducing the psychometric in the language and in the way that the clients or the candidates will understand. As Nikita said, Ben's example, I think that's really great, because the way we communicate how the assessments are going to be used can really increase inclusion, like a lot. Otherwise, some people do get very spooked when you say, you're going to be assessed, it's going to be part of the selection process, and they're already feeling very pressured and challenged. So the way we communicate that is really important. Inequitable social consequences, which is the use of the test must not lead to unfair outcomes. And again, that's where adverse impact comes in. Measurement of different constructs. So the test must measure the same constructs in each group. And then differential predictive validity. The test must predict outcomes equally well for all groups. Again, adverse impact can assess this too. So those are some ways. There's some more ways as well. Bit more geeky language. I got this from another paper, Herbert and Caningoni, 2013. Checking if the questions work the same way for different groups. As I said, gender, age, social class, throw in any kind of differentiator you want and see if there's any differences. Expanding criterion predictors. So instead of focusing on one type of assessment, which again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you're going to use more than one way to assess a candidate. Otherwise, I'd be really scared. So I don't have to tell you that. You do that already. But the ones that you're mixing the psychometrics with, just make sure that they're actually valid, reliable, culturally open, etc. Bandings, and I think I had this earlier, but I heard someone talking about treating test scores in a range equally rather than ranking based on tiny score differences. So, and I think people do this a lot in education as well. When I was a lecturer, the hanging nines, couldn't have a hanging nine because I've had to round up or round down, especially when it's 39. It's either a 40, it's a fail or a pass, so figure out which one it is. So it's the same kind of thing when we're looking at psychometric scoring. What kind of nuance can we add so we're not kind of just throwing things in without context? Differential prediction, checking if the assessment predicts job performance equally well for all groups, as I said. Using standardized tests, again, I don't have to tell you this because everyone's using standardized tests here. So yeah. And then I've got some questions. Controversy, the first question. Do we actually need to use psychometric? Oh, who wants to answer that question? No, I mean, I'm being facetious here, but not in every context, it might not be fully appropriate. And also, what tests are we using and why? So those are the questions we really need to ask. And like I said, for a selection process, it's a little bit of a different context than development conversations. So in a development conversation, I feel like the weight of the psychometric isn't as great, so it doesn't necessarily hold the same consequences that a psychometric for selection could hold. So that's why I'm saying it's a separate thing. Are assessments affecting the way we think good is or good enough is or the best candidate is? Myself and Christelle a minute ago actually were talking about, are we using the tools to help us decide on what good is, or are we already creating the context and the skills that we think is good based on our research and context of the organization and location, and then using the tools to kind of check? So which one is it? And are we moving away from the latter and aiming for the first option? So that's another thing that I think we need to talk about. And can we use alternatives? So is there another option? Is there another assessment we could use? Can we use it in a different language? Do we need extra time? And again, I know that the next couple of presenters are going to be talking about psychometrics and neurodiversity, and I'm really excited to hear about that. And last but not least, are we doing enough to ensure fair and equitable selection and assessment? So the floor is yours.
Okay, so first of all, So Sir Francis Galton is actually, he's often said as one of the fathers of psychometrics and also the father of the term eugenics. So I always say, we have the same dad. And I always say, once we start seeing other humans as numbers, once we look at history books, after that point, nothing good happens. So the key thing is that, especially when we use, we don't track applicants, even when not the psychometric itself, even the way you write that email makes a difference. It is so fragile. And how often we just don't look at it? It's like it doesn't exist. It's like we're inclusive. Well, what are you exactly doing about this? Inclusive? It's like, oh, our assessments are not impacted by neurodiversity. How do you know that? I called the distributor and said there's no correlation between personality and neurodiversity. You know, it's so fascinating because it's not that, to me, diversity, neurodiversity is not that it is threat to psychometrics. I think that, to me, is just an indication that what psychometrics were before, they did not acknowledge it, and they were based on an illusion of average that never existed in the first place. And most personality assessments tell you more about the author than it does about your client anyway. And I loved, you know what's my favorite thing about today is that I know I'm in my tribe. Nobody used the word science. We use scientific. Psychometrics are scientific on a good day, but it's not a science. My dad is a professor of applied mathematics and physics. Whenever I tell him psychology is a science, well, we have disagreements. But that's for my therapy sessions, not for you guys. But what I want you to do now, just for a couple of minutes before we give to Ali, so before we have questions for Grace, I want you to just pair up with somebody you haven't talked to before. So not necessarily the person next to you, but person maybe behind you or to the side of you, and just discuss what are your thoughts on, no, leave those questions, and any of those questions, like, and then we'll have a few questions for Grace. I just wanted to get more debate, as you said. Let's get them debate and the questions. See how this helps. I thought this kind of Ali will be talking about on a large scale. And then we'll talk about AI and stuff. That's kind of fine. Yeah, make sure to get yourself a book. All right, finish your sentences. Okay. Okay, where's my gavel? The person who continues speaking in 10 seconds will get a 50-pound donation to charity. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, go in. Oh, well, you're all quite down now. Okay, questions, thoughts, reflections on Grace's talk. Oh, Daniel, are you going to be as summarizing as last time or more verbose?
I am not a fan of DSM. I think it's a measure of societal view of what's normal and abnormal rather than medical. Do you think the DSM has anything to do with how psychometrics are applied or developed?
I just want to ask Danny, we talked about selection. This is clinical. Any particular reason you ask this question?
So for me, the DSM, things like ADHD or autism are currently categorized in the DSM. For me, as a personality psychologist, I believe that ADHD, for example, is a measure of high openness, low conscientiousness, and it's only societal's view of society's not comfortable with dealing with the additional, can't think of the word, but the DSM helps us view that as a deficit rather than just a different way of processing the world.
Excellent. Oh, okay, so we went for DSM. Oh, Grace, I know you specified selection, but are you happy to answer this?
I think it's a really good question. And I think the origins of it, correct me if I'm wrong, essentially are with the DSM, it's the medical model, the medicalization of mental health, mental illness, whatever you want to call it. And also it's American. We don't use, well, we use it here, but there's another, is it the IP something? I can't, I, ICD in Europe? Yes. International, but I for international. Anyway, so those two tools, but I think it's again very culturally specific, and you can see that in the use of psychometrics as well. So that kind of measurement of behavior and personality and intelligence, whatever construct you want to think, I think does come from the same, like you said, the same father and mother, probably. So yeah.
Oh no, we're far too sexist to have a mother. We just have a father of psychometrics. So, you know, the key thing is that in psychometrics industry, that is, DSM is fascinating. Renee, I get your question, but this is a true story. A copy of my DSM-5 was nicked from a pub. It happened, but the joke is on them. They'll be self-diagnosing all the way home. Yeah.
Just I have good news for you because the DSM is on its way out. The whole psychopathology, how we not diagnose, but how we describe ill-being, mental ill-being, is moving in conventional personality mode. Personality disorders out. The ICD is actually doesn't have the old categorical personality disorder model in them, so you're winning.
Will you have clinical psychologists at your Edinburgh conference?
Yeah, we have some. Yeah.
Great. Indeed. But yes, absolutely. The key thing is what we can learn from each other. And on that note, can we just have a wonderful round of applause for Grace?